Okay, well, let's dig in a little bit into the initiating phase, the first phase of the project management methodology. The initiating phase is the phase where you either construct or you're given the project scope, sometimes called the project implementation documentation or PID, but for the sake of this context, I'm just going to refer to it as a scope, where you either initiate or you get the scope handed to you, and you try and work out the feasibility or the viability of the proposed scope. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's just say um, let's work on the concept that it's an idea that you have. You have a particular idea, an initiative, an opportunity for improvement in the workplace in your role. And you go to your manager and you speak to your manager about it. And you say, look, I have this great idea. I think it can be really valuable. It'll save us a lot of time, potentially save us some money, and I think it's going to produce a better output of whatever my work is. Let's say it's a service that you provide. Before your manager makes a decision on whether to invest the time and the energy and the resources into doing it, they'll want to ask you for some more information. They'll say to you, okay, that sounds, give me a brief overview of what you're talking about. They'll go, okay, that sounds really interesting. Before I commit to this, though, I need to have some more information. So they'll send you away and they'll ask you to, and it may be using direct language like a scope or not, but they'll ask you to go and scope it out. And then you go away and you add some flesh or some meat and bones to the concept that you have, the idea that you have floating in your head. In the context of this unit, though, it's more going to be the case that your manager will come to you and say, "Oh, we've got this initiative that needs to be executed. It's not business as usual. We don't really have much heritage in this, or we may have something that was similarly done, perhaps a while ago. But I'd like you to take responsibility for it, and I'd like you to manage this particular initiative." And in that case, they'll give you the context of what needs to be done. And if we're talking in a project management methodology, they'll give you the scope of what needs to be required. So the scope would generally be a document or documentation, depending on the context, that has a number of these components within it. Normally, a scope has a specific name to it, which helps to identify it from all the other projects that are going around. So it might be Project ABC or Project Alpha 1 or something like that. Generally speaking, and particularly when we talk about in the government context, it'll have an overview of the context. So this project is part of this particular strategic initiative or business initiative, and it plays an integral part in this part. Then it'll identify some broad project objectives. So the objective of this project is to deliver this particular product or service to this particular end user. Then it'll determine the scope. Now, the scope, when we talk about the scope in this context, we're talking about what's inside scope and what's outside of scope. And when I describe this, it's helpful for me to use the analogy of working out in a field. Let's say you're an earth moving operator. So you have a little bobcat, and your business is about going and providing a service of digging out holes or just digging up soil for clients. And you get a call from a farmer, and the farmer says to you, I want to create a little dam in one of my paddocks, and I'd like you to come and do the job. And it might be some to and fro and with quotes and whatnot, but let's just cut to the chase and say, okay, so they want you to do the job. So you grab your bobcat, you put it on the back of your trailer, on the back of probably your four-wheel drive, a little mini truck, and you drive out to the paddock. And the farmer says, this is where I want it here, and this is the size I want it. Before you start work, you'll probably grab some type of barriers, some type of rope system or barrier system, as I said, to mark out what's within your area of responsibility, and then by doing that, you exclude everything else outside. So you would say to the farmer, okay, that's cool. I'm gonna dig out this hole to create a dam here to your specifications. I'm going to put up these barriers. Everything outside of the barrier, that's cool. You can travel in amongst your kids. If you've got kids running around the farm, they're quite happy to go around there. Your livestock can go everything everywhere outside this barrier. Everything within this barrier, that's my responsibility. I'm responsible for everything within this barrier. So health and safety, my equipment, and so forth. So whilst I'm working here, your kids can't come in here, your livestock can't come in here, and even if you're going to come in here, you have to call for me from this particular location. I'll come and grab you, because this is this area here where I've marked out. That's my scope of responsibility. So I like to use that analogy because it's a nice clear analogy in my mind's eye to say, okay, when we're scoping out a project, that's what we're doing. We're working out what's within our responsibility within the scope of the project, and sometimes we have to clarify what is outside, because sometimes the barriers of demarcation are a little bit ambiguous. So even within your scope document, you might say, okay, this is within the scope of the project. These things are outside of scope of project. So sometimes, it might be, for example, within the scope of the project is communicating with the key stakeholders. Outside of the scope of the project is communicating with the public about what we're doing. That's somebody else's responsibility, if that be the case. So the project scope is determining what's in and what's out. Sometimes you might have to put in a business case in terms of financials. This is the financial justification for it. So, for example, you might do a cost-benefit analysis within there. This is what it's going to cost. This is what the benefits are going to be, and this is the return on investment, if that's what the business requires in terms of a financial argument. You'll have deliverables in there, and deliverables are that not always have to be tangible, but it's most commonly a tangible output from the project. So when we talk about deliverables, we're talking about things that are going to come out as a result of the project that we're doing. That can be physical things, such as if the project is about undertaking a report, the project deliverable might be the report at the end, but there might be a number of drafts that are going to be produced along the timeline that are also deliverable. So draft 1 will be a deliverable, and draft 2, and so forth. You may have an information sheet that's going to go with this report, like a one-page marketing document that's going to be circulated for people who aren't necessarily going to read the report but need to understand what the key points are. That's also going to be a deliverable. If we're doing something such as, let's say a staff event, say we're going to have a social event and it's going to include things like food and entertainment, the deliverables will be things such as providing food at the event, providing entertainment at the event. It might be providing a final report at the end of the project to be able to communicate what the project delivered on. So we think about that in terms of the scope. What are the things that we need to produce as a result of my work in this project? We think about assumptions and constraints, and assumptions and constraints are really the bedrock to when we think about things like risk management. So assumptions are things that we're taking for granted are going to occur within this project. So we're going to take it for granted that some of the resources that are already existing within the business are going to be available to us. So, for example, if the project's going to require us to produce some information sheets, and these sheets are going to be circulated, and it might be that we need to print up 500 of these circulation sheets, we're going to make assumptions about the availability of copy paper, of 500 sheets of copy paper, and assumptions about the availability of printing machine, because they're standard resources, and usually speaking, we should be able to use those without having to put in separate requisitions for those. So we name up those assumptions so that so that we can have clarity around what are the things that we're assuming are going to happen for our project to be successful. But then we look at the other side of the coin. What are some of the things that are potential constraints? So, for example, if there's a high reliance on the project team, potential constraints might be things like seasonal absenteeism. If it's the winter period, it might be things like flus. If you've got pandemics going on, it might be things such as availability for mobility of project teams, with border restrictions and transition restrictions and so forth. So we'll name those up as well as we're thinking about the scope. The scope will also have things such as a project methodology or the stages that we're going to run through the project. So it might be this is the steps that we're going to take. We're going to initiate it. We're going to sign off on this scope first, make sure everyone's happy. Then we're going to develop the plans. Those plans are going to be circulated so that we get everyone's key stakeholders' input into those. And we're going to develop the schedules, and then we're going to start executing the project on this particular date. Then we're going to have these particular events occur in this sequence. So we start to name up the methodology and the stages that we're going to go through. And as part of that, and sometimes these can be merged together, but I'll keep it separate for now. So the next stage will be milestones and dates. So as we think about our methodology and our stages, we'll start to think about some of the key milestones within that. So now I'm starting to map out the journey from the start of the project to the end of the project. So now I can start to really think about what are some of the key points along that journey that we can start to identify as major milestones. So, for example, the production of the first draft, the sign-off of the first draft, the production of the second draft, the sign-off of the second draft. So we can start to think about some of those key milestones and start to set some dates around those. And this is really now starting to flesh out our vision about when and how much and so forth. So once we've thought about our milestones, we've thought about our dates, we're starting to think about what are the things that we need to be doing to get to the outcome, the project outcome. We can start to think about these quality standards. What's the level of performance that we need to achieve? And that'll start to get us to think about things such as resource requirements. The resource can be human resources, such as individuals. And when we break down individuals, we're actually thinking about skill sets. And what skills do we need? How much of those skills do we need? What's the dynamic or the mix of that skill set? We can also think about physical resources. What tools do we need? So, as I said earlier, to photocopy a paper, well, we need those, but they're standard, so we don't have to account for those. There might be some other stuff that's non-standard that we have to requisition. And then that's going to have a flow-on effect back to our milestones. We think, oh, hang on. If it's going to be a significant requisition, we might have to go to tender. That's going to take an approval timeline because of the process. So we have to start to shift some of these dates and milestones and so forth. We think about the key stakeholders. We identify those and the level of influence and interest that they have and what we need to do around consultation and communication strategies, which flows on to the next point. And then we think about how we're going to monitor the progress of the project and control it. So are we going to have regular review meetings? Is there going to be data that needs to be produced so that we can review it at these meetings? How often shall we meet? Do we have daily scrums or stand-ups, or do we have weekly project team meetings? And we start to flow all that start to construct all that. And then we, based on our assumptions and our constraints and the milestones and the dates and the resources and the comms that we've thought about, we can now start to put together a risk management plan about things that can go wrong. How seriously do we take those things going wrong? What are the likelihood and consequences of that occurring? What are some of the actions that we should be taking or treatments to deal with those? And that's pretty much the components of the scope. Then the scope gets signed off by the project sponsor, and we're right to go forward. Now, if we were the project manager and we were developing the scope, we would nut all these things out. We would flesh them out. We would go back to our sponsor. Our sponsor would look at it and they might go, looks pretty good, but that timeline's a bit too long. We need it to I need it to be completed in 8 weeks instead of 10. So then we might go back and make some more adjustments, and you might go back and forth until the sponsor goes, yep, look, really happy with that, and we sign that off. Once the sponsor signs that off, that becomes the basis for your project, because once they sign it off, we go into the next stage, which is the planning stage. And once we go into the planning stage, we're actually effectively kicking off the project. So as a project manager, you're accountable against what was approved for you to commence. So that means that whatever gets signed off on the project scope is what you're accountable for as a project manager. So if the goalposts shift, so if the deliverables change, if the resources are no longer available in terms of, let's say, you were signed off for X amount of dollars and now you've got X amount less 20%, all those things, if anything changes once it's signed off, it's going to have a detrimental impact, or a positive impact, I suppose, if it's the other way. But it's going to have an impact on your ability to deliver to the scope, which is what's been signed off. So this step is actually quite a significant step, because as a project manager, it's the baseline for your accountability. I'll talk more about baselines later in terms of planning, but when I think about baselines in terms of accountability, this is the baseline. So if anything shifts, any of the goalposts shift throughout the project, you have to come back and adjust the scope and get it signed off again. So your sponsor comes back to you and says, "Ooh, Tony, businesses, there's been a new initiative or a change in direction. That project, I know that we said it was going to be, you had it for 8 weeks. We need it now in 7 weeks." And you'll go, "Oh, okay, all right. That's going to be tough, but I'll go back to the drawing board." You'll go back to the drawing board. You'll crash, and we'll talk more about some of these things later. You'll crash your project in the sense of, you'll inject some more resources. You're going to get some more people and some more time, some more money, but you can do it. So you go back and go, "Yep, definitely, we can do it. I've had to change the plans. It means, we're going to spend a little bit more in these areas, but we can do it within that time frame." And your sponsor goes, "Yep, that's great, no worries." Then you get them to sign it off again, because that then becomes your new accountability baseline. Because you don't want to get to the end of the project and then your sponsor go, "Well, you did a good job, but you overspent in these areas." And you're like, "But you authorize that." So we want to make sure that this project scope is an organic, always living, breathing document. Now, in the context of this unit, you're going to be handed the project scope. So in this case, your manager signs a scope. You have to check these things to ensure that you're happy to deliver to these things, because that's what you're going to be still accountable for at the end of it. So even though the scope has been constructed for you, before you take on and start the next stage, which is the planning stage, you need to make sure that you're happy and you can live with those components within that scope. So you're happy, you understand the deliverables, you understand the milestones, you understand the methodology that's been set out for you, you understand the resources that you have available, and you're happy to work to those. Because once you take that on board, as I said, that's your accountability baseline. So the project scope becomes a critical component in just making sure that you've done all your pre-work before you set out into the actual planning stage. So in the context of that, where can we get the scope from? Well, the scope is most commonly going to come from your project sponsor. It's most commonly going to come from your manager or a senior manager, and it's going to be handed down. They're going to give you this is what needs to be done, this is how much you got, this is the deliverables, and so forth. And so that's most commonly, and in most common cases, it's either going to physically be handed to you, or it's going to be emailed to you, or you're going to be pointed to the direction on your intranet site or SharePoint where you're going to access that. So this is the information that you require. Here's the scope or the project implementation documentation, and have a look at it and let's get going on this project. And these projects, by the way, should drop out of larger organizations. It's like larger organizational plans. It's like every other planning aspect in the business. It'll dovetail out of either a strategic initiative or a corporate plan initiative. It'll come out of a divisional or a branch or a team goal or plan. It'll dovetail out of something that is a bigger organizational picture. So your project will come out of something like that. And that'll be articulated in your background information within your scope as well. But sometimes it can come out of things like continuous improvement plans, or sometimes it actually can be a smaller component out of a larger project. So and this happens in the private sector a lot. For example, where I talked about the example I gave earlier about if I'm an electrician in a building on a building site, you've got projects within projects within projects when you talk about construction, and different project managers responsible for different elements within that. So in terms of sources of the scope, you'll get them from your project sponsor or your manager. Sometimes you'll get them from your clients, where your clients will directly give you the scope with the approval of your sponsor. Sometimes you'll come up with the scope itself, as in the examples I've been using earlier. And just understanding that whoever is the source of your scope is also the person you need to go back to clarify any details about that. So if any sections of your scope, if you're unsure about any sections of your scope, you go back to the person who, or the source of your scope, to clarify those things before commencing the project, which is really important.